Hello, everyone. Phil Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat. Today's episode is Advent of the Carpetbaggers. Of course, this is about Reconstruction. Click on the notification bell in the far upper right to be notified when future episodes of Civil War Chat are released, and also the subscription button here in the lower right to subscribe to future editions. Before we get started, I just want to show you my book, Southern Reconstruction. A lot of what we're going to be talking about will be available to you in this book. It's $26 at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other fine bookstores. If you want an autographed copy, then just email me, Phil_Leigh, Leigh, at me.com. And I'll sell you an autographed copy for $30, and I'll cover the postage to get it to you and the packing and everything. Okay, so yesterday I talked about the presidential Reconstruction before the carpetbag era and the passage of the 13th Amendment. Now, the key point there was the 13th Amendment ended slavery. And many of the southern states, in fact, all but Mississippi, voted to ratify the 13th Amendment, and Mississippi outlawed slavery in its state constitution. So what's important about that period is that the people that were elected to the legislatures in the South that ratified the 13th Amendment were all white. They were typically all native Southern. They were not carpetbaggers. They were not scallywags. Many of them, in fact, had served in the Confederacy and in the Confederate Army. But as I pointed out, when they were elected to the legislatures and also the state offices, they were the electors, the voters tended to pick Southerners who had not supported secession at the start of the war. That's why Alexander Stephens was sent to Washington as a senator for Georgia, even though he was vice president of the Confederacy, because before his state of Georgia voted for secession, he had opposed secession. When it voted for secession, then he went along with it, just like Lee did with Virginia. But to recap, when all those guys showed up in Washington in December 1865, the Congress would not seat them. But those legislatures, those Southern legislatures, those lily white Southern legislatures did vote to end slavery by ratifying the 13th Amendment by December 1865. Now, to get to the advent of the carpetbaggers, what the point of departure here is that the Northerners, particularly the Republicans, the Republican-controlled Congress, the Republican Party, looked at the situation. They saw, well, the Southerners are going to vote to end slavery. Then, these are pretty reasonable guys. We've got to do something to ensure that when these states get restored into the Union, that they don't become Democrats, because if they're Democrats, as they have historically been, then they could join with the Northern Democrats and take over control of the federal government, which is, that's something that's just intolerable. So in order to ensure that when the Southern states were restored into the Union, that they not be Democrat, the Republicans came up with the idea of the 14th Amendment, which would basically ensure that the Southern states would be puppet regimes of the Republican Party controlled out of Washington. So let's get into how that 14th Amendment got proposed and how it got adopted and how that led to the advent of the carpetbaggers. In 1866, after the slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment in December of 1865, the Republican Party proposed the 14th Amendment, although they had not permitted any of the Southerners elected as congressmen or senators to be seated in Congress. They proposed the 14th Amendment. the amendment, I'm going to just jump ahead here a little bit. The amendment did get through Congress with a pretty overwhelming vote in the House, but in the Senate, the vote was 33-11. And it is necessary, if an amendment originates in Congress, that Congress first give it a 2/3 majority. So the 33-11 was a 2/3 majority, but here's the rub. None of the southern states were represented in Congress. If they had been, you would have had 22 new senators. The 22 senators added to the 11 that voted against the 14th Amendment would have made the vote in the Senate 33-33, clearly short of the 2/3 majority necessary to advance the 14th Amendment out of the Congress and to be sent to the governors of the states for a 3/4 majority, a ratification by the states. So that's an important point to keep in mind about the 14th Amendment. It was really set up to ensure that whatever states from the South came into the Union or rejoined the Union would rejoin the Union with Republican puppet regimes. And it would never have gotten through Congress if the Southern states had been represented in Congress. But Congress just ignored that. The Republican-controlled Congress just ignored that. So let's get to the specific provisions of the 14th Amendment. There's really only 5 of them. First, it declared that all people born in America would be citizens. The reason they did that is because the last word on citizenship with respect to blacks was the Dred Scott decision of 1857. And that ruling said that blacks could not be citizens of America. So the first article of the 14th Amendment said that anyone born in the United States, any male born in the United States, is a citizen of the state in which he lives and also of the United States. Now, that was clearly preparatory to interfering with the voting rights of the states. Typically, the voter qualifications in the states from the beginning of the country in 1789 had been left up to the states. Well, this first provision of the amendment was pretty clear warning shot that the Republicans expected to get the blacks the right to vote in the states. They would just use the federal power. They would use the amendment to get the federal power to ensure that blacks would have the right to vote in the southern states. And therefore, they would have a new electorate that could be used to establish the puppet regimes in the southern states. The second thing is that former Confederates could not become office holders in the government. If anyone had taken an oath of loyalty to the United States, or any oath of loyalty to the United States through either the military or if you're a politician, and you then served as a soldier or an officer or a civil officer in the Confederacy, then you could not be an office holder in the United States. You could not get elected to Congress. You could not be a senator. You could not be a judge. But basically, the second provision here removes the best qualified people in the South from becoming political leaders. So that would open up the door for carpetbaggers to come down from the North and basically set up the regimes, because they wouldn't have to worry about running against strong candidates of the native Southerners. And the third point is the 14th Amendment ensured that the debt incurred by the United States would be honored by the United States. And it's really, it just really shows the sensitivity that the Yankees had to being sure that they got paid. They're just basically saying, our bonds are going to be paid off and we don't care if somebody says that they shouldn't be. Well, it's really kind of ridiculous. I mean, it wasn't necessary at all. And then the last provision of the 14th Amendment was that Congress will have the authority to pass laws to enforce the other provisions. So the final point that needs to be mentioned is that representation in Congress would be determined by not just population. That's because the Constitution was set up so that blacks accounted for purposes of congressional representation, a three-fifths of a human. And what the Northern Republicans wanted to do was to be sure that if blacks were not given the right to vote in the former Confederate states, that the blacks would be removed from the population of that state for purposes of calculating its representation. The point here is that if the Confederate states were readmitted to the Union, the three-fifths clause would no longer be applicable, and the population of the states would be taken at face value. Bottom line is that the House of Representatives would not only restore the previous number of congressmen from the southern states, but it would add 11 more. So those are the provisions of the 14th Amendment. And because the Southerners could see that what was happening here was an attempt by the Republican Party to lay the groundwork to take control of elections in the South instead of just leaving it up to the states, all the Southern states except Tennessee voted against the ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1866. And of course, no doubt that vote against the ratification was also no doubt influenced by the fact that the Southern states had no representatives in Congress when the 14th Amendment was written and when the 14th Amendment got through Congress. And as I pointed out, if the Southern states had representation, particularly in the Senate, then the Senate would not be able to give the 14th Amendment a 2/3 vote majority needed to get out of Congress and then be sent to the states for ratification. So in 1866, when the Southern states, except for Tennessee, refused to ratify the 14th Amendment, the Congressional Republicans, the Radical Republicans regrouped and decided in 1867 that they would force the Southern states to adopt the 14th Amendment, whether they liked it or not. And that was accomplished through the 1867 Reconstruction Acts. There were a couple of provisions that were important. First is the Southern states, even though they had their own civil government, they were still occupied. They were militarily occupied. And if, for example, the military people in the state that disagreed with the civil decision or a law passed by the legislature, they could just override it. Also, the Freedmen's Bureau could ignore any legislation that the states down in the South might pass. But what the 1867 Act did is sort of amplify and underscore those points. It divided the Southern states into 5 military districts, in which the district military commander had dictatorial power. It didn't matter what kind of laws or judicial decisions came out of the civil governments in the South. If the military dictator in that region disagreed with it, he could just ignore it. and overrule it. And the second thing that was important about the 1867 Reconstruction Act was that Congress required the former Confederate states, except for Tennessee. You see, Tennessee is an exception because Andrew Johnson had been governor of Tennessee. He became Lincoln's vice president. And when he was governor of Tennessee, he disfranchised all former Confederates from voting. So former Confederates in Tennessee couldn't vote. And what that meant is that the people that could vote in Tennessee would be people that came from outside the state, and also people in the state that had never supported the Confederacy. So the voter rolls, the number of registered voters in Tennessee dramatically declined because so many of the citizens were disfranchised. But the point is that it was a strong Republican regime before the carpetbag regimes even came into existence. It was essentially the first scallywag regime, and it was strongly Republican. So the other 10 states were divided into these military districts. Now, probably the most important Reconstruction Act of 1867 affecting those 10 states was a requirement that they hold voter registrations. All males were to come in and register to vote, including blacks. It's specifically stipulated that blacks had to have the right to vote, and they could come in and register. Additionally, the registrars could have wide latitude to when examining the voter registration of a white man to determine whether or not he had been in violation of the provisions of the process, so that he could be excluded, he could be disfranchised. As a result of this, the process of registering all these voters, the blacks became a majority of voters in 5 of the 10 states: Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, and South Carolina. The other 5, some of them they ended up with carpetbag regimes anyway, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. The purpose of getting the 10 states into the Union before the 1868 elections was to ensure that a Republican was elected president in 1868. Of the 11 states of the Confederacy, all but 3 would be back into the Union for that election. That would, and the 3 that were not allowed in was because Congress did not accept their constitutions. The 3 that were not allowed in were Texas, Virginia, and Mississippi, leaving 8 Confederate states, one of which, Tennessee, was already scallywag, and so that leaves 7. And of the 7, 5 of them had black majority voters, and the other 3, one example being Arkansas, was not a majority black, did not have a majority of black voters, but when the new government, the Carpetbag government, was formed, the legislatures passed a law that disfranchised former Confederates. So let me, I'm a little bit ahead of myself there, because what I'm explaining is the first step was the registration of voters, which gave 5 of the former Confederate states majority black voters. The next step was the requirement that once the voter registrations were taken, that each state hold a constitutional convention and develop a new state constitution for the 10 former Confederate states. Again, Tennessee is not in the picture, in this picture. Now, these constitutions were typically described as progressive. For example, the southern states prior to the Civil War did not typically provide for public education. A number of these new constitutions did, but the new constitutions also created a lot of expenses that the previous governments didn't have, such as public education. And the burden for paying for all of this fell on the taxpayer, and the taxpayer in those days in the states was primarily the property owner. Property taxes, which we still pay today. Where I live in Florida, there's no income tax, so the property taxes are high. But in those days, property tax was the whole thing. So the important point about the state constitutions is that if Congress did not approve of the given state's constitution, then the state could not have its representatives put into Congress. And that's why Texas, Mississippi, and Virginia were excluded from the 1868 election, which is the first election after Lincoln's 1864 election, where Andrew Johnson came in as vice president. That's why those three states were not included in the 1868 election. Now, by the time the 1868 election did come around, the Republicans had vassal regimes in all of the Confederate states that did get to vote. And again, that excludes Texas, Mississippi, and Virginia. All of those vassal regimes, except for Louisiana and Georgia, voted for Ulysses S. Grant as president. And that's because, well, they were vassal regimes. Now, the exceptions are interesting because if they were vassal regimes, then you might ask, well, if they were puppet regimes of the Republicans, then why didn't Georgia and Louisiana vote for Grant, whereas they actually voted against Grant pretty decisively in the case of Louisiana, but much more narrowly in the case of Georgia. And the reason for that is that the Ku Klux Klan and similar organizations were active, particularly in Louisiana. And in Louisiana, they were active because Black registered voters were represented 2/3 of all voters, whereas they represented only about 50% of the population. So it was pretty clear that the white qualified voters were excluded during the registration process, just arbitrarily. And that led to a lot of anger. Now, in Georgia, it was a similar situation, but not so prominent, not so excessive. Now you might think, okay, well then the Ku Klux Klan got away with it, right? They got away with the terrorizing and intimidating voters. Well, okay, let's look at what really happened. In Louisiana, the Republicans still controlled the state government, even though Grant lost the vote, the popular vote, and the electoral vote in Louisiana in 1868. State government was still controlled by Republicans. Well, when they saw what it was really the Knights of the White Camellia in Louisiana could do to to suppress Black vote, they passed a law which said that all returns in future elections would be counted by an election returning board. And the members of the election returning board would be appointed by the Republicans. So it didn't really matter what in the future Louisiana elections, it didn't matter what the true vote was. The election returning board was going to return a Republican victory. So that's how Louisiana became an ironclad Republican state. In Georgia, the situation was a little different because what happened is prior to the November or the autumn election in 1868 for president, you had earlier elections for the state government offices. And the Constitution of Georgia, which Congress approved, never gave blacks the authority to hold office. They could vote, but there was never anywhere in the Constitution that said that they could hold office. So what happened is that once the legislature met, some of the white legislators agreed. They put forward a bill that would remove the black legislators because they claimed they had no authority to hold office. Well, Congress then, so came back and said, well, that's not, you're not going to get away with that. I don't care if we overlook that or not. You're just not going to do that. So they basically told all the all the Democrats that were elected to the Georgia legislature, you're out of here, and we're going to replace you with your opponents. So that's how Georgia became a carpetbag state. Now, the purpose of this video is to describe how the advent of the carpetbaggers. The next video will talk about the governments of the carpetbag states and how that went. But again, you can get this from Philip Lee's Southern Reconstruction. It's $26 at Amazon's and Barnes & Noble, $30 from me if you want an autographed copy. Okay, that's our show for today, and thanks for watching.